works across multiple languages. As an acclaimed translator of Arabic literature, he works with prominent English language publishing houses to introduce the writings of Arab poets and novelists to a broader audience. Kareem has received numerous awards, fellowships, honors, residencies for his work, including the Penn Center's 2017 Translation Prize, 2018 National Endowment for the Arts Translation Grant, the 2015 Northern California Book Award for Best Translated Poetry, Poetry Magazine's 2014 Translation Prize, a Fulbright Research Fellowship in Germany, a CASA Fellowship in Cairo, and residencies from the Lannan Foundation and the Banff Center for the Arts. As a freelance professional translator of Arabic, French, and German into English, he has produced hundreds of texts since 2003, books, essays, movie subtitles, plays, poems, speeches, and more, covering a range of topics from art history, Islam, Buddhism, to genetics, politics, and particle physics. As a professional editor of American and British English, he has worked with institutions around the globe. Most recently, he worked as a freelance translating editor for a book project with the Museum of Modern Art. Kareem is also the author of the book, The Poetics of Adonis, and I feel like
Yves Bonfoy.
Yves Bonfoy, thank you. Poetry as Spiritual Practice by Lockwood Press. Kareem received his PhD in Comparative Literature from UC Berkeley in 2016, and his dissertation was on poetry as spiritual practice. He earned his master's in comparative literature from UC Berkeley as well in 2007, and his bachelor's in French with a minor in German from Princeton in 2003. At Princeton and afterwards, he was mentored in translation by the late American poet C.K. Williams. He brings a scholar's rigor to his translations and his editing work, and he has taught university courses in many different languages, English, Arabic, German, and French amongst them. He's half American and half Egyptian, and Kareem was born in Kuwait in 1981 and has lived an itinerant life across the Middle East, Europe, Asia, and the US. Since 2012, he's been an avid meditation practitioner and spends a couple of months each year on retreats, studying and practicing under teachers from different lineages and traditions in the US and in India. He recently spent several years traveling around the world and working remotely, with South India being his main base. Since 2018, however, he's been living in the countryside outside of Santa Fe with his wife Paige and their son. Paige is here joining us today. Thank you so much for being here. In 2020, during the pandemic, I sent in an application on a complete whim and Sarah Beckham's urging here to the Emerging Translator Mentorship Program, which is sponsored by ALTA, the American Literary Translators Association. Kareem was one of the mentors judging the applications. And though I didn't end up getting it, what I did get was a very generous email from Kareem saying that the collection I was proposing, which was a sort of juxtaposition of revolutionary South Asian poets like Faiz and Iqbal and Sahir, from our anti-colonial struggle, to sort of put them side by side with young poets from Delhi and Mumbai on the streets today, this was a book that should exist, and that he offered to help this absolute stranger in every possible way. That book has not yet happened, but the idea of it is now an advanced level language course here at UW-Madison in our Hindi program. So my students and I are especially thrilled to have him visit us and talk to us about how to expansively translate texts, both Asian, not Asian, but it could be Asian, ancient and modern, and in doing so perhaps expand ourselves. So with that, I welcome you here, Kareem. Thank you for your time, for your scholarship, and over to you.
Thanks so much, Sarah, for that introduction, and thanks to the Center for South Asia for inviting me. It's really, really nice to be here. And it's fun to talk about something a little bit different today for me. So I want to start by making sure I don't go over time by setting my timer. But I want to start just sort of by saying where I'm coming from with this talk. I very frequently give talks on translation and translation praxis, so we're going to kind of focus on that since that's my main job. But I'm going to sort of bring in also the scholarly aspects. As Zara mentioned, my dissertation, my first book was on poetry as spiritual practice, so that's going to come in as well. And then I'm also kind of going to be talking a little bit from the perspective of meditation practitioner. I studied in sort of, or practiced in many different schools, Burmese Vipassana, was kind of the beginning, and then have been with teachers in Zen, different Zen traditions, Advaita Vedanta, and also the Tibetan Nyingma tradition. So that some of that's going to inform the talk indirectly as well. And what I'm going to do is, before delving into specific examples from Sufi and Buddhist texts, I'm going to kind of give you the Cliff Notes version of my translation approach in philosophy with some examples, some of which will be from Arabic and then a few from some other languages. And so this is going to be a little bit of a whirlwind talk. We're going to cover a lot of ground. It's not going to comprehensively address any of the texts that I'm talking about, but the idea is to kind of light a spark with our all of our translation approaches. And I'm going to be focusing primarily on spiritual texts, but they apply to any text, really. So hopefully it'll just light a spark for any of us who are engaging with translation, whether as scholars or translators or students. So one of the main things I want to do is to expand how we think of translation, and especially how we think of, there's this notion of faithfulness or fidelity with regards to translation. And when we think of translating a text, we're often thinking of translating on the level of meaning. That's the level we kind of usually stay at, the meaning of the text. And there's sort of an unspoken assumption that if the translation accurately mirrors the meaning of a text, that it's a successful translation or a faithful translation, right? Now, again, the overarching metaphor here for translation is a mirror, right? So there's a source text, the translation is a mirror, and somehow it gives it back to you in a different language, but it's mirroring it perfectly. And if we're talking about, let's say, a legal document, that metaphor might hold pretty good if you're translating something very dry and legal and it's really just about the meaning. But it becomes much more complex, the situation becomes more complex as soon as we get away from those kind of texts. So the genre I talk about the most and translate the most frequently is poetry. And I like talking about it because it's really easy to see a lot of the other levels when you're dealing with poetry beyond meaning, like the pure just sort of dictionary meaning of words. And I want to look at a few of these levels quickly, and I'm going to give you some examples of each so we're not speaking in abstractions. All right, so one level that's pretty closely related to meaning, but it's not synonymous with meaning, we'll start with the closest, is image. And here's an example of a very, very literal translation. This is a 2-line short love poem by a contemporary Iraqi poet, Dunya Mikhail. And it's from the Arabic. So first line, there's no problem. Whenever you throw stones into the sea, and then the second line is one word in Arabic, atamawaju, which is a kind of strange word from the noun meaning mauj, which is a wave. So it's something like, I become a wave, I become wave-like. We can go with a Latin, I undulate, which comes from the Latin word for wave. But I think when you look at all of those, none of these possibilities would be considered particularly good poetry in English. None of them sound very good, honestly. They don't resonate as poetry, right? So this is a translation on the level of meaning, okay? Now, can we go to the second slide, Zara? This is the translation. This is zooming back away from the meaning of the words and looking at the image, okay? And it was published in a book from 2014 called the Iraqi Nights. So whenever you throw stones into the sea, it sends ripples through, right? So you can see what happened there. Pretty obvious example, but sometimes when translating, we forget to take that step back and try to, especially when we're like grappling with something hard, it's like, I know what's going on, but it just doesn't work in English or whatever language. Taking a step back to the level of the image will work. Now, a lot of stuff has changed, obviously, right? So I've gotten the image, but I've lost, for example, the concision. That second line is one word in Arabic, right? It's also turned what was grammatically, where the feminine voice was grammatically an active subject in the Arabic, it's become more passive here, grammatically, right? It sends ripples through me. So a lot of stuff changed, but again, I think the job of a translator is to kind of have a clear vision of whatever text they're working with, and to let that vision decide which aspects of the text are going to come through and which ones maybe have to be left by the wayside. With poetry, you're almost never going to convey everything. So that's one example. Now, another one which is pretty obvious is for poetry is sound and musicality. Okay, and that's one that with poetry you really have to bring sound into it in one way or another. And for me, the metaphor of the mirror, it usually doesn't work on sound. There's no way you're going to get all the sound of the original. It's just not possible. English, like stuff like rhyme especially, doesn't work very well in English anymore. It sounds very dated. And so, for most of my translations, even when I'm translating classical Arabic literature, I want the translation to feel modern in terms of its aesthetics, right? Even if the text is very old. And so what that means in English is that things like rhyme and regular meter might fall away. Okay, I tend to go for more free verse translations. What it doesn't mean is that I completely abandon sound, right? So for me, it's less about mirroring and it's more about compensating and maybe creating some new stuff, if possible. So, for example, you can compensate for a lack of rhyme and regular meter in English with a whole bunch of different sound devices, like assonance, consonants, interesting rhythmic moments. There's all sorts of stuff you can do. And so I'm going to give one example of that. I should say the sound thing, which I talk about a lot, is super easy. Every time I talk about it, I try to give a different example because you can use, whether it's from my work or someone else's, because it's not hard to compensate for rhyme and meter and stuff if you're going with free verse in English. So here, this is from arguably the oldest Arabic text we have, or I say arguably. It's the pre-Islamic Mu'allaqa, or hanging poem of Imr al-Qais, which is 6th century AD, and it's the first, always the first in this list of 7 to 10 poems that were considered the examples of pre-Islamic Arabic poetry. And so I'm just going to read 2 lines of the Arabic. You'll be able to hear the rhythm and the strong rhyme in it. وَقَدْ أَخْتَدِي وَالطَّيْرُ فِي وُكُنَاتِهَا بِمُنْجَرَدٍ قَيْدِ الْأَوَابِدِ هَيْكَلًا مِكَرٍ مِفَرٍ مُقْبَلٍ مُدْبَرٍ مَعًا كَجُلْمُودَ صَخْرٍ حَطَّهُ السَّيْلُ مِنْ عَلٍ. So this is from the middle of his poem. The whole thing, it's about 100 lines. Each line is 2 hemistichs, so it's very long. Like in English, it's much longer. And this is from the middle. It's from a famous section, probably the most famous description of an animal in Arabic literature. It's where he's describing his horse, and then it goes into a hunting scene. And so I'm going to just read some of my translation. Again, it's very like Homer. We don't need that just yet. Sorry. Like Homer, these texts were meant to be memorized. They were passed down orally for over a century before they were written down. And so there's very strong rhythm. There's very strong rhyme. With my translations, I thought, we don't need to memorize these anymore. They're primarily written documents. They're going to be read. And so I left out really all regular rhyme and rhythm. And so one of the things, just while I'm reading this, I would suggest try to listen for the sound as well. And for those of you who translate, one thing I do always with poetry, I don't do it with prose, is when I really think I've polished the translation and it's finished, I try to read it once in English with completely ignoring the meaning. In other words, just reading it in English as if it was a foreign language I didn't understand and listening to the sound. And I think it's a good exercise. So here I'm going to read about half of the description of the horse, maybe a third. Often I've risen at first light, the birds still in their nests, with my horse, his hair trim, his massive body ready to hunt the wild game. How quickly he moves, charging forward and drawing back as in a single motion, poised to rush down from on high like a torrent of stones. His hue, the dark of wine, his back, so slick the saddle felt slips from it like raindrops off rock. He's fierce, though lean, and the sound he makes when he sets off is like a seething cauldron. Quick and smooth as flowing water, his hooves barely touch the earth, while the other steeds stumble and kick up dust. The light young rider slips from his back. The robes of the heavy-set rider who hangs on hard are flung to the wind. He's that quick, like the spinning top that children whirl with sturdy thread. So that's an example of sound. You can use anything really for sound. There's a lot of good examples. So I'm going to do one last level just to sort of hit home going away from meaning. And we're getting a little bit less and less tangible now, I think, with this stuff. And this is like emotional impact and emotional emphasis. And actually, sorry, this is not the last level. This will be the second to last one. So this is, again, I mean, this one is pretty obvious, but it's interesting to see some translators will really emphasize this and some won't. And I'm just going to read two very short excerpts here. So this is the beginning of Homer's Iliad, okay, and two of the most famous translations of it, and the first couple lines. And Fitzgerald, so the beginning opens with Achilles, okay? Robert Fitzgerald, 1974 translation. It's a good translation, there's nothing wrong with it, but here's how he opens. Anger be now your song, immortal one. Achilles' anger, doomed and ruinous, that cost the Achaeans loss on bitter loss. Good translation, all right? But I want to read then Robert Fagel's, which is 1990. Right, and at the beginning of the Iliad, Achilles is mad. He is really, really mad. All right, and so that's what Fagles decides to emphasize. And here's his first two lines: "Rage, goddess, sing the rage of Peleus' son Achilles, murderous, doomed, that cost the Achaeans countless losses." And then it goes on from there. So you can see the meanings are pretty much the same in the two. They both, but it's that emphasis, right? And so, similar to this is something, I'll often call it punch. It's not quite emotional impact, but it's kind of the way a text hits home, the feeling it leaves you with. And it's sometimes very, very difficult to pin down. It's a bit more slippery than something like tone, right? And so, I want to give you my translation of a short poem by the contemporary Palestinian poet, Najwan Darwish. And the title is "Who Remembers the Armenians?", which is a quote attributed to Adolf Hitler. And this was how Hitler justified moving into Poland and the Holocaust. And he basically said, well, the Turks massacred the Armenians. The Turks massacred the Armenians. Nobody remembers them, right? And so very brutal historic moment to try to justify an atrocity. And so this is Najwan Darwish, his poem in my translation. Who remembers the Armenians? I remember them, and I ride the nightmare bus with them each night. And my coffee this morning, I'm drinking it with them. You, murderer, who remembers you? Right? So there's one where, with this poem, it needs to have punch. It's obviously a very powerful text. Now, what I'm calling punch, it's not just for texts like this. I'm working on it's a project that involves a lot of translations of children's books from different languages. And so you can, to switch gears a little bit, a lot actually, you can keep that up, that's fine, I'll get to that. But, you know, Dr. Seuss, you finish reading a Dr. Seuss text and there's like a whimsical quality. It's a certain feeling that's very difficult to describe, but it's definitely there if you're reading it, right? So how do you get that in a different language, right? And then German has that lovely word, das Unheimliche, the uncanny, that people wrote about a lot. That's feeling that's almost like a David Lynch film or something. Something weird's going on, something's off. I can't really say what, but there's definitely something askew a little bit. So those kind of things are important when translating. So now we're coming finally to the sort of crux of this talk, what I'll be speaking about for the rest of the time. And this is a sort of a hypothesis that I have. And the hypothesis is that effectively or successfully translating spiritual texts might require a special sensitivity on the part of the translator, right? Or maybe in some other cases, some unorthodox translation approaches. And we're going to look at some of them. Some may be more successful than others. So We're going to start with Muhyiddin Ibn Arabi, who lived from, and you can go ahead and keep that up there, it's fine. He lived from about 1165 to 1240 of the Common Era. He was born in Andalusia, in what's now Spain, but he spent decades of his life traveling all across what's now the Arab world. And he would keep coming back to his own place of pilgrimage, which was the Kaaba in Mecca, which incidentally, that very first poem I read, the legend is those poems were so good they were hung from the Kaaba in Mecca when it was still a pagan site of worship before it became the center of Islam. And in Mecca, Ibn Arabi began having mystical visions, and he would later describe these as openings, was how he termed them. And he's known as a, perhaps the most famous Sufi who wrote in Arabic. And it was at the Kaaba in Mecca in the year 1214 that he wrote one of his most famous collections of poems, which is called Tarjuman al-Ashwaq, which is usually translated as the Translator of Desires. Okay? And these were poems about a beloved figure, usually female, sometimes male. It's fairly common to switch in medieval Arabic poetry, but most of the time it was a woman. And there was a lot of debate around whether those should be considered Sufi texts. He was definitely a Sufi, but these poems, some of them are quite profane, and he was criticized in his life because people said these are too profane, they're about a real woman, they're not about the divine beloved, and you shouldn't have written these. In fact, there's a legend that when he read them at the Kaaba in Mecca, a woman started criticizing him, saying this is, and anyway, he actually went back and wrote an entire commentary on the poems, telling everyone these are about union with the beloved. Basically, it's not about sex or whatever. So, whatever the case, there's clearly a Sufi element in them, and so we're going to look at a couple of these. And if you're wondering why I'm speaking about these particular texts, or I'm just going to look at one poem, actually, this one. It's because in the last year, 2 translations have come out in English of this book, which is really rare. Like, there may not be another translation of Ibn Arabi for 20 years that gets published at any kind of mainstream press. So we're going to start with Michael Sells, who I think is one of the absolute best people translating classical Arabic poetry. And this book came out of Princeton University Press in their Lockhart series of translations. And Sells is great because he's got a scholar's rigor, he knows the Arabic inside and out, and he's also just a great poet. And this is actually the first text in the book. So we're going to just take a quick look at this. And he calls it bewildered. I wish I knew if, and let me say something, the they here, even though it's a masculine plural, this is a fairly common way to start poems in Arabic. The they likely refers to his beloved and the other women in her tribe. That's usually how someone would interpret this. And it's very common to begin a poem basically with a moment of separation and remembering when the beloved was there, but now they're gone. That's a trope in Arabic. It dates all the way back to that very first poem that I was reading. It begins with a scene where the woman has gone and the poet is left there weeping, basically. But Ibn Arabi takes it and does more of a Sufi thing with it, right? So, bewildered. And this title is from Michael Sells. It's not there in the Arabic. I wish I knew if they knew whose heart they've taken, or my heart knew which high ridge track they follow. Do you see them safe or perishing? The lords of love are in love, ensnared, bewildered. So, a couple interesting things here. First of all, a lot of stuff about knowledge, right? So I wish, and 2 different words are used for knowledge, right? But he's already pointing at a different kind of knowledge, not just our usual intellectual, conceptual knowledge, but he's already pointing to knowledge of the heart, or my heart knew. And knowledge from the heart is something that comes up over and over again in Sufism. There's an expression, it's in many different schools, the eye of the heart, ayn al-qalb, and sometimes they'll use the word fu'ad, which is another word for heart or core of one's being. And it's pointing towards a knowledge that is not conceptual, right? And again, he's starting to point towards what we would consider the union with the divine, right? Which is certainly not exclusive to Sufism, right? And joining with the divine, and the divine as a beloved, right? And in Islam, at least, it's usually, there is one divine, right? So it's a bit different than some other religions where you have a pantheon and then you kind of pick the one you're most drawn to or the one that's calling to you. So that's one thing, this new type of knowledge. And then the second one is down at the bottom, and interestingly, Sells decided to title this one Bewildered. So there's a word in Arabic, al-hayra, or hara, which means to lose, to become lost, basically. There's many different words for lost, but in the Sufi context, over time, it comes to take on this idea of like a divine unknowing, right? Like you have to let go of your orientations, your usual mental, conceptual orientations, to find this deeper orientation. And it's that unknowing that can allow for at least a temporary extinguishing of the separate self, which then allows for the union experience, right? So all of that comes in here. But with these poems, at least, it's interesting because the union is always temporary. So the poems are very much about kind of, I got it, I lost it. Ibn Arabi often talks about, he's always trying to get back to the beloved, and then he also makes the point, you can't grab onto it. You can't grab onto that experience. The second you grab onto it, you lose it. So in a certain sense, you're trying to stay in the state of bewilderment, which is very positive. And some modern poets, including Adonis or Adonis, use that concept a lot in their poetry. I'm going to read, I'm not going to put them up on the screen, but I just wanted to mention briefly. So I said there were two books, right, that came out of Ibn Arabi. So one is the Michael Sells, which I highly recommend, the Translator of Desires. And the other one is an experimental project. And I really like the work of both of the translators, so I just wanted to mention it and read a couple of theirs. It's called Agitated Air, Poems After Ibn Arabi. And it's two fairly young translators, Yasmin Seal and Robin Mojer. And they're both amazing translators, and they translate on their own. And I believe, I think Yasmin was in, I want to say she was in Turkey, maybe Istanbul, and Robin is based in South Africa. And what they did, so it's the same collection. They didn't do the whole collection. But what they did was each of them wrote a translation of one of the poems, and then they sent their translations to each other and basically worked on the other's translation and wrote a response based on that translation. And they kept going back and forth with each text until it petered out, basically, or they felt like, okay, this is a good. So it was a really interesting process, I think, especially with texts that are about bewilderment and not grabbing hold of something, and there's something slippery going on with Ibn Arabi. So I thought it was kind of neat, and their results are quite different than Michael Sells. I love the Sells. Sells is still pretty close to the Arabic, I would say. He's a scholar as well. And so I'm just going to read the three that they produced for this one. Okay, I'm just going to read them. So this first one is Robin Mojer's. Oh, and I should say this came out this year, like 2 months ago, from a small press called Tenement Press. But you can get it online. Again, it's called Agitated Air. I wish I knew they knew what heart they held, that my heart knew what path they tread. You wonder, are they safe or perished? The enamored are in love adrift, ensnared. And now here's Yasmin's. I wish to know, are they alive? To what heart's theirs to hold, to have? Only been told which way they'd go. To be able to say they made it through. In love's haze, our lovers led astray. Very different from Robin's, right? And then they just put one more in for this first poem. And so this is Robin Modgers again. They never knew what heart they took. My heart would know the path they took away, and asks, are they still here or gone? In love, love's masters spun and falls. Very different, but it's an interesting approach because it brings out, I talked about all these different levels in a text and the translator having to, emphasize some and let others fall away. When you're doing something like this, you can, over the course of several poems, you can emphasize a lot of the different aspects and come in with alternate interpretations as well. That's Ibn Arabi. Now, I want to note, unorthodox translational approaches are not uncommon with Sufi literature in English. And the most famous Sufi authors in English are not Arabic-speaking, they were wrote in Persian, right? And specifically, Hafez and Rumi, right? And those two, at least in terms of sales, have been the most successful translations, right? And specifically, so we're going to look at two of them. There's the work of the Persian poet Hafez, which was rendered into English by a guy named Daniel Ladinsky. And Ladinsky lived for many years at the ashram of Meher Baba in Maharashtra, in India. So he identified very strongly as a spiritual practitioner. And most Americans who've read Hafez have come to him through the 1999 book he put out, which was called The Gift. And then he's done others since then. All right. Now, he doesn't speak Persian. He never has. And he doesn't call them translations. He bases his renderings on an 1891 translation. So a kind of Victorian era, very dry, scholarly translation. Okay. But he calls them renderings and he calls them interpretations. So he's careful not to call them translations. All the same, if you get one of his books, Hafez is listed as the author of those books. So there's an implied thing that he's translating, right? And at least an implicit claim to translation. Now, more interestingly, Ladinsky claimed to have seen Hafez as God, as the sun, in visions and dreams. And he said that Hafez sang to him in English in those visions and dreams, and that's what he was writing down. So basically, he claimed to be channeling Hafez in his translations. Right? Now, there's a fairly recent Al Jazeera news article. It's by a Persian professor in the States, Omid Safi. The article is called Fake Hafez, How a Supreme Persian Poet of Love Was Erased. Okay? And I want to just read a quote. I think it's a really interesting quote. Part of what is he's talking about Ladinsky's translations. Part of what is going on here is what we also see, to a lesser extent, with Rumi. The voice and genius of the Persian-speaking, Muslim, mystical, sensual sage of Shiraz are usurped and erased and taken over by a white American with no connection to Hafez's Islam or Persian tradition. This is erasure and spiritual colonialism, not simply a matter of translation dispute, nor of alternate models of translation. All right. I'm going to leave it there with Ladinsky. His translations do read very well, we have to say that. But and I'm not trying to advocate for one or the other. I'm just giving some of the more extreme examples. Now, interestingly, now with Rumi, you have Coleman Barks. Everybody knows Rumi through Coleman Barks. And his translations have become wildly popular. Some people say they're the best-selling poems in English, period, from the last 100 years, not just translations. Now, Coleman Barks, like Ladinsky, doesn't read Persian, okay? But interestingly, in that same Al Jazeera article, the author mentions Barks briefly, and he calls him by far the most gifted of the versioners who reinterpret Rumi using literal Victorian-era translations. And he doesn't go into it at all, but it should be noted that Barks frequently worked very closely with a Persian scholar, John Moyne. And Moyne is often listed as a co-translator. So there's another level going on there of sort of quality control that Ladinsky didn't really have, right? And it should still be noted that Barks transforms Rumi. And so he basically gets rid of all the Islamic references, and there are a lot of them, and universalizes him as a poet. And here's a quote by a scholar of Sufism at Rutgers, Muhyiddin. He says, and he's talking about Barks here, "The Rumi that people love is very beautiful in English, and the price you pay is to cut the culture and religion." Right? And that was part of Barks's vision of Rumi, was he said, look, really, he transcends religion. I mean, in a certain sense, that's true. But he uses it to kind of justify some of the cutting. And what's interesting is that when Barks talks about Rumi, he will use Sufi concepts in the original Persian or Arabic. So he's familiar with them, which is interesting, but he takes them out of the translations. So, whatever we think, and I want to also say there was a 2017 New Yorker essay by the journalist Rosina Ali, and it's called "The Erasure of Islam from the Poetry of Rumi." And it's an interesting article because it goes in depth into Coleman Barks's translations. But I still think we have to ask ourselves the question, what makes a translation like Barks's translation so successful, right? And I guess my main point here is that what makes it so successful is a different translational approach, right? And one that we could say is specific to more spiritually oriented texts. Okay, and it contrasts very starkly. Usually with these kind of texts, the first translation you get is a dry, scholarly translation, somebody doing the grunt work, so to speak, all the hard work but it's not an inspired translation, right? And often those then lead to people who are more poetically or spiritually inclined coming in and working on them. And so with Barks, the example, in 1976, the American poet Robert Bly gave Barks these older translations by an Orientalist, A.J. Arbery, very famous Orientalist, incredible Arabic scholar, but dry translations. And what he told him, and this is a quote, he gave them to Barks and said, "These poems need to be released from their cages," which is I think is very interesting. And Rumi went about that. And here's, how do you do that? What do you do to release a poem from its cage, right? So I want to quote Barks here, and this is what he says. He says, "It's like being in an apprenticeship to a master. With the Rumi work, I try to get out of the way and disappear." So it's interesting. It's not as big of a claim as what Ladinsky was claiming, right? Ladinsky, I think, was kind of trying to justify his translations, right? Now, again, what is it that makes these kind of translations so successful? So I'm going to throw out another hypothesis that kind of follows up on the last one. And that's that if there's a clear sort of transmission quality to a spiritual text, then a successful translation has to take that into account, right? What is being transmitted? We talked about that ineffable quality that's getting close to what some texts might call transmission, or some traditions, right? And now, here's the second part of the hypothesis. It may be that effectively conveying a transmission can only be done by a translator who has direct, non-conceptual experience of what the text at hand is pointing to. All right? So in other words, as Barks is suggesting, the act of translation itself essentially becomes a mode, a kind of spiritual practice, right? This is a big claim, all right? Now, this kind of means that translation is a specific kind of spiritual practice, basically, when you're working with this kind of text. Now, I'm going to, for the last 10 minutes or so, I want to move into Buddhism, because Buddhism really talks explicitly about transmission, right, which is not as big of a thing in Sufism. And so far we've kind of been speaking of mystic union with the divine, right, and that model of spiritual experience. So we're going to move to what's often considered the core Mahayana Buddhist text, which is the Prajnaparamita Sutra in 8,000 lines. And, it's difficult to talk about spiritual experience in scholarly terms, I wrote my dissertation on it. It's sometimes hard to pin down, right? But I want to take up a couple of the distinctions I made, right? And so in the terminology I'm using here, there's a fundamental difference between a temporary experience of union with God, we can call it source, reality, Buddha nature, whatever you want, the absolute being. So there's a difference between that, right, and an ongoing perception of the world through a non-dual lens, wherein the sense of a separate, individual self falls away and kind of reveals itself to have been an illusion all from the very start. So that second thing, the non-dual, persistent non-dual experience or perception, is what in Buddhism they would call one of the possible modes of enlightenment or stages of enlightenment. So on the one hand, you have a mystical experience, which lots of people write about, but those are peak experiences, so they don't last for very long, right? Now, mystical experiences may, for some people, be part of something that comes about through meditation. It may be part of the spiritual path, but it's not the same thing as what would be called nirvana or enlightenment or liberation, depending on the tradition. Okay, so what that is pointing to, nirvana, enlightenment, liberation, is not a specific single experience of the world, but a certain way of experiencing it. It's the way of experiencing that comes about when the sense of a separate self, the whole bottom drops out of it. Okay, so here's what the Prajnaparamita Sutra in 8,000 lines says about it. It says it's free from any, so perfect wisdom is free from any concept of spiritual attainment or mystical union. So again, there's this separation. It's not mystical union, right? And that point is made several times in this text. Now, interestingly, this isn't just in Buddhism and Sufism. There's a Christian, she's from the Catholic, she was a nun in the Catholic Carmelite order. Her name is Bernadette Roberts. And she wrote 2 books that were published, I believe, by SUNY Press. And one of them, the first one was called The Path to No Self. And the second one was called The Experience of No Self. And she talks about, she calls it a second contemplative moment. So she was a nun in this order, and her entire life she had believed and thought union with God is where it ends. And here's what she wrote. This is in the second book, all right? I took for granted the self was the totality of being, body, and soul, mind, and feelings. A being centered in God, its power axis and still point. Thus, because self at its deepest center is a run-on with the divine, I never found any true self apart from God, for to find the one is to find the other. That's her explaining her union experience, which lasted for a couple of years, according to her. Now, because this was the limit of my expectations, I was all the more surprised and bewildered when, many years later, I came upon a permanent state in which there was no self, no higher self, true self, or anything that could be called a self. Clearly, I had fallen outside my own, as well as the traditional, frame of reference, when I came upon a path that seemed to begin where the writers on the contemplative life had left off. And the whole book is her grappling with that, because she originally experienced it not only as no self, but no God. And her tradition was, well, how do I reconcile now God and Christ and all these concepts with this? And it's an interesting book. It's a little bit technical. And then she goes on to state, basically that the only writer she could find in the Christian tradition that could help her with this was Meister Eckhart, who was a famous mystic from the medieval period. And he was the only one who could offer her help upon this, and she calls it the journey beyond union, beyond self and God, a journey into the silent and still regions of the unknown. Those are her words. So, I want to, for the last 5 minutes, it's going to be fairly quick, but we can read a little bit about from the Prajnaparamita Sutra. And this follows, so this is the 8,000 line version, or 8,000 sloka version of the Prajnaparamita Sutra. And there are many different versions of the sutra, right? They range from 100,000 lines all the way down to 1 syllable. right? And then there's a couple famous ones in between, the Diamond Sutra, which is 300 lines, and the Heart Sutra, which is 25 lines. And then the single syllable is apparently A, or A. So anyway, there's all sorts of legends about this particular version, the 8,000 line one. And it remains extremely, it's considered the core text of Mahayana Buddhism. It remains extremely important to Tibetan schools of Buddhism. And the scholar Robert Thurman even said the following. He said, in East Asia, it seems clear that Prajnaparamita served as the basis of the Chan and Zen traditions. All right, so it's a very important text. And there's a lot of legends about how it was found. And it didn't really, it was 100 BCE when the text sort of came about. So there's questions of, well, was it really from the Buddha's time? How did it, 400 years after the Buddha passed. So, the historical Buddha. So, there's, again, we have kind of two versions of this, like with some of the others. So there's the first version, which is the linguistic grunt work. And it has to be applauded. And that's Edward Kanzi. And he just calls it the perfection of wisdom in 8,000 lines, and it's verse summary. And it's a scholarly version. He is sympathetic towards the text, but clearly the translation, I was trying to find a part to read, and it's just very dry. It doesn't soar, right? And you can tell some of the core concepts he's not writing or translating from direct experience, right? There's words in there and terminology like suchness and these things that you can kind of see he's regurgitating it a little bit. And that same scholar of Buddhism, Robert Thurman, says this. Kanzi himself did not practice the yoga of transcending wisdom, and he was somewhat skeptical about its mystical message. Only late in life did he encounter the great Japanese scholar and meditation master D.T. Suzuki, who helped him change his attitude to one of greater reverence. But this was too late to transform his whole oeuvre of translation. He never found the liberating logic of what might superficially appear to be meaningless paradoxes or irreconcilable contradictions. And again, a lot of stuff in Zen in particular, they talk about like heart wisdom or prajna wisdom, being able to see in such a way that you can hold seeming contradictions together, right, at one and the same time. All right, and later on, and I like this one, this is a good one, this quote from Thurman. His translations thus resemble cookbooks, full of recipes translated with a dictionary by someone who has no idea what the foods and spices are, who has never cooked or never eaten such a meal. I have assigned his translations to classes of students. I think Thurman taught at Columbia. I have assigned his translations to classes of students, decade after decade, with the invariable result that they feel confused, mystified, and shut out of the real message of the text. So, that's Thurman. Now, I want to give an example of, so a couple decades later, a guy named Lex Hickson comes around. And he produces a book that he also does not call a translation. It's called Mother of the Buddhas, Meditation on the Prajnaparamita Sutra. And he used Kanzi's translation, right? That was the main text he used. He also looked at the Tibetan, there's Tibetan commentaries and there's Chinese renderings of the text. He looked at other stuff, but the main text he used was Kanzi. And this dry kind of cookbook translation, so to speak. And he calls it, again, a meditation, and he also says it's a contemplative expansion. So he looks at it almost, he's a student of meditation coming to this and trying to bring it across. And I also like, he's much more humble than some of the Sufi translators we looked at, because he says his translation makes no claim to spiritual or scholarly authority, right? So he's just kind of giving you this book, here you go. And what's amazing is that this translation sings, and it is clear everywhere where the other translation is, and I'm calling it a translation for convenience's sake. But I'm just going to read a few selections, and we can kind of end on those. I'm going to read maybe 2 paragraphs. And this will give you a sense of the text, and also a sense of what's being transmitted. We talked about transmission, right? So here's one part. This is near the beginning. Buddha, bodhisattva, prajnaparamita, these are merely abstract terms composed of certain sounds and letters correlated with certain conventional perceptions and concepts. What they point at has never substantially come into being. What they indicate is an uncreated and hence ungraspable and unthinkable presence. The same is true of self and universe. Although we speak conventionally about the personal self, assuming that we are encountering it constantly, no self with separate identity of any kind has ever come substantially into being. And then he goes on to say, when this most radical truth is unfolded to an aspirant, or a seeker, without causing the slightest fear or anxiety, then one knows with confidence that the aspirant is a bodhisattva, an adamantine awareness who flows as perfect wisdom. So that's typical of this text. There is an undercutting of the concepts. There's no substantial reality to perfect wisdom, and yet here it is. And here are the practitioners of it. And then I'm going to read one other part, and this is kind of the radical. So that's part of what's being conveyed, is that ungraspable presence. That's part of the transmission. And it comes through very clearly in this text, where it doesn't come through at all in the kanji. But the other thing, and we'll end on this, here's from the next page. The absence of the substantial creation of any form is not different from the radiantly transparent, harmonious, and coherent functioning of all forms. Thus, absolute openness and relative functioning are not divided. They are not two alternate dimensions, but utter simplicity. And then he goes on to say, thus the consecrated heart of love is identical with the clear mind of transcendent insight. So this text is interesting because over and over again it hits at the transcendent insight, but then over and over again it also says the relative world is where this comes in. The bodhisattva will never has to liberate all beings. So it's almost like the relative takes precedence over the absolute, which is very rare in these kind of, precedence is maybe not the right word, but it is never to be eclipsed by the absolute. And most of the pointing texts you have in almost any school of Buddhism are pointing at the absolute over and over again, trying to get that, right? No separate self, this ungraspable presence. And so that's kind of what makes this text so radical, is that compassion comes in super strong in it. And the relative is just, it's imbued with the absolute, but the absolute never eclipses the relative world. And in fact, it's the suffering of the relative world that allows the compassion to come in, because if it weren't for sentient suffering beings, there would be no need for Prajnaparamita, or this mother of the Buddhas, because there wouldn't be the suffering. So it's very interesting text, but again, I'm using it as an example of a kind of crazy translational approach. And I've gone over time, I'm very sorry. But thank you very much, and we have a few minutes for questions. Sorry I went over.
Well, before we open up for questions, I just want to also say